Thank you very much, Mrs. Modenbach, Dr. Stamatolopoulos, ladies and gentlemen. Let me try to present to you, with the help of some pictures, as you rightly said, Mrs. Modenbach, the word "come on" has two different connotations in English. The report, der Bericht zum Club of Rome bedeutet drei Dinge. Erstens, also los. Erzähl mir nicht, dass die derzeitigen Trends nachhaltig sind. Keineswegs. Zweitens, also los. Beweg dich und hänge nicht altmodischen Philosophie nach. Und drittens, also los. Komm mit uns auf eine aufregende Reise in Richtung auf eine nachhaltige Welt. And what is interesting, the German publisher found an exciting, a very good translation, because he said it's our turn. And if you fail, then we will have to suffer from it. So we are now speaking German, and I'm going to try to briefly outline the climate catastrophe, what we have to know, and all of you know this. We must know this. If we look at, in order to bring about a dramatic change in the industrial landscape, which we will now be faced with, the Secretary General of the United Nations, in the last personal conference of the contracting states of the climate conference, said, if the Earth is in flames, we cannot continue this way. And the Earth is on fire. Climate damage worldwide of all kinds. In India, this happened 2 years ago, an enormous drought in areas that were twice as large as Germany. People had to be supplied with mineral water because they didn't have water. And on the other hand, we have floods or fire hells. And here in Germany, in Ahrtal as well. In summer 2018, Sweden had 28 large forest fires. The co-president of the Club of Rome, Anders Wigman from Sweden, I talked to him on the telephone at least once a week. He said, now the next big bushfire. And then this 15-year-old girl, Greta Thunberg, sat before the parliament in Stockholm and protested. This may not continue this winter. And after the bushfires, every Swede know what she was talking about. Then I met her 1 year later when the first pan-European students' conference of Fridays for Future took place. She coined this term and she initiated this movement. So it was not just EU, it was also Belarus and Estonia, and all the European countries were there. And I had the pleasure to give the introductory speech. Then I talked to her 30 minutes and I found her fantastic. She was very humble. We then had a press conference when the first journalist asked, well, Greta, tell me, when is your big moment? And she said, there won't be any. I'm here to listen because I want to listen to the scientists and to what the students from all over Europe mean. And if you ask me, I will tell something so completely different. So in the press, she was presented like a publicity, like a girl striving for publicity. No, she was a very interested, humble, and intelligent young woman. So I talked about some climate issues. But what is most dangerous is the rise of sea levels. I took these two pictures from an Italian school atlas, Italy during the last ice age, when the Adria was only half as large as today. and Italy was correspondingly large. And before the last hot area, half of today's Italy was submerged. And the rise at the end of the worm ice age took place very rapidly. Around 800 million Asians live directly by the sea. The red dots are million cities, some of them with 20 million inhabitants. So, for example, Mumbai and Shanghai. So imagine the sea level rises a little bit faster than now. Then we will have a refugee problem, which could be 50 times as large as the one we had in 2015, which we were unable to manage politically. But the real problem that we need to address is this. So far, gross domestic product per capita is strictly parallel to carbon emissions per capita. So these are the 8 most important economic sectors: agriculture, transport, services, and so forth, and of course also industry. And the small dots are the nations from left to right, GDP per capita, and from bottom to top carbon emissions per capita. This is a drama, and we want to reverse this now. Of course we want to have more wealth also in the future, but less carbon. And for conventional technology, this is something that is impossible. But we can manage this. I worked in California when Al Gore was vice president of the US and when he published the Inconvenient Truth book. And he also made a film which I watched. And then a cartoonist painted this picture: a cinema on the one hand, an inconvenient truth is offered, and on the other hand, a reassuring lie. So, and all people go to the reassuring lie. People do not want to listen to the truth. This is the problem. Pointing at the politicians would be foolish, but where people determine democracy, this is the real problem. But those people who are talking about climate protection today try to avoid this more or less, because you cannot blame the people in democracy. But this is a very big part of the problem. So is there a carbon exit? But here in the rural area we know how it is, by the way. I spent 3 marvelous years of my life in Essen, when Zollverein was still very busy, but it could already be foreseen. At least air pollution was so unpleasant. But by now, unfortunately, this is over. But the carbon exit takes place only in Europe. While we are sitting here, around 600 new coal power plants are planned or built. And of course, who should be blamed for this? Most of them in developing countries. In this regard, climate policy, which only concerns or addresses industrial countries, is largely physically pointless. In terms of moral and politics, it may make sense, but we must take the developing countries with us. And how can we take them on board? Because in today's India, a new power plant is a license to print money. So this means they have no problem, no issue with the steel industry, so they burn more coal. So what can we do? The Scientific Advisory Board on Global Environmental Changes, which addresses the Chancellor directly, in 2009, before the planned climate conference in Copenhagen, they developed the so-called budget approach. And Dr. Merkel was told, and it goes as follows. All the countries of the world get a per capita right to atmospheric pollution, which is identical for all the countries, but the old industrial countries, which are shown in red here, already exhausted the corresponding budget. They ate it up. Developing countries in green here still have quite a lot left. But because we, not just for power plants, but also combustion engines and all the other things, but because we continue producing carbon, we want to be climate neutral by 2045 or something like this. But we must now go to the developing countries and ask them for licenses. This is the idea that underlies this budget approach. Dr. Merkel bravely presented this at the Copenhagen conference, but the Russians and the Saudi Arabians and Kazakhstan and the Poles and the US Americans said, but not with us. We live off this, that we emit carbon. And then she put it back into the drawer, because who want to support something where half of the world doesn't support you and doesn't join you? But intellectually and afterwards politically, we have to understand why this budget approach is so enormously reasonable. And the next picture shows this is the Indian Minister of Economics, who is today the most aggressive customer of new coal-fired power plants. But if we get this budget approach right, then the same gentleman would suddenly think, well, of course, we could also speed up renewables and increase energy efficiency. We don't need new power plants, coal-fired power plants. We can continue operating the old ones a little bit longer. And the licenses that are released by this can be sold to the Europeans. So for the first time in history, a developing country would have a profitable climate protection. At present, it is a loss, and so they don't do it. So there are several political measures that emerge. The budget approach could be the most important measure. At the beginning, not many countries will join, so we have to start with a climate club, as Olaf Scholz also requested. And on the 4th of September and on the 24th of September, when the Fridays for Future take to the streets again, they will say the very same. Then renewables and hydrogen technology must be supported, and this is what this entire event is for, and I appreciate this very much for VGB. Recirculation economy and energy efficiency, which is not yet so clear in this program. And greenhouse gases must be dumped or converted, which is also a topic. But this part too is still lacking. Come on, don't stick to outdated philosophies. We need a new enlightenment. But I will talk about this at the end of my presentation. Anyway, Europe is the only continent which takes the climate crisis seriously. These are pictures from The Guardian 2 years ago. In black, we see the countries which didn't promise anything. In Paris, red, those which didn't promise enough. In yellow, those which were a little bit better, but which lie at us. For example, Brazil. Brazil should be shown in black, and blue are those countries which seriously undertake climate protection, and these are the Europeans and I think British Guiana. But let's first start again on a purely pragmatic basis. Enlightenment comes later. One of today's pragmatists is Frank Massiot, the CEO of EnBW. Yesterday in Frankfurter Rundschau there was a great article from him. He sees an enormous opportunity for the renewal of industry. And he says completely rightly, and this was also mentioned here several times, also you said this, Mr. Stamatolopoulos, industry and state must work together, the state must set the frame, and the industry has to deliver. But if the state sets the wrong framework conditions, for example, like today in India, then industry can't do a lot. And otherwise, he also says completely right, the necessary amount of renewables, and to generate this in Germany alone would be illusion. We need a foreign climate policy, purely domestic policy, as some ideologists and idealists do in Germany, wouldn't help the climate. Renewable energies. It is very, very important. The German Renewable Energies Act was the pioneer worldwide and the role model for 100 countries, especially the Chinese. Solar electricity is much cheaper today than nuclear electricity. And so please let me say a little bit about how it was at that time. In 2000, I was in the SPD faction in the German Parliament, and Hermann Scheer came to me and said, I have the draft of a Renewable Energies Act. I completed this and I presented it to the ministry in charge, which was the ministry with Werner Müller, the Ministry of Economics, and they say, we won't do this. We are not fools. A kilowatt hour solar electricity costs €1, 2 Deutschmarks at that time. And if you pay a cost-covering remuneration to those who feed in the electricity, then you have a program of destroying hundreds of billions of euros for your ecological foolishness. That's impossible. And so I talked to Hermann Scheer for a while and said, okay, let's do one thing. We go to the chairman of the parliamentary group, that was Rita Stuck, and asked that in the parliamentary group we can discuss your draft law and we can vote on this. And then we went to Struck and he said, and he was incredibly well informed and he knew exactly what the Minister of Economics and the Chancellor thought, and he was against it. And he said, okay, now 2 faction members come to me and ask for a point in the agenda, an item on the agenda, and I do so. And then the meeting was, and Hermann Scheer at this meeting delivered a fantastic and convincing speech, especially by emphasizing that this price of €1 per kilowatt hour will decrease dramatically if you start with this as soon as it pays off for manufacturers. And this is exactly how it happened. By now, in sunny countries, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Australia, Chile, and so forth, the kilowatt-hour solar electricity just costs 1 cent. This is a tremendous and dramatic revolution. And today's meeting here benefits from this, and we have to think about this. And what Massiot said, doesn't have to happen in Germany alone. It can be that a major part of green hydrogen is produced in sunny countries. Bananas and sugarcane and oil. We don't produce all this in Germany either. And so it must be traded internationally. This brings me to the next topic, and that's the car in Germany. Everybody believes that the electric car is the panacea. Then we accept that fuel cell and hydrogen cars are nice if it's green hydrogen. But I admit, for a while, hydrogen would still have to be produced from gas. And as you said quite rightly. So is this the solution? No, it is not. It is part of the solution. Worldwide, we have around 1 billion cars with combustion engines. And now you can think what the share, which percentage of the owners of these cars would be prepared to scrap their cars and to buy an electric car from Wolfsburg. I would say, optimistically put, it would be 5%. Here on this picture you see a one-way street in Bangkok. And in the other direction we have another 6 lanes. So in order to illustrate with this combustion engine cars, in other words, for the sake of the climate, we urgently need climate-neutral combustion engines, otherwise we would have lost, because it can't be so fast with electrification worldwide. But it's all possible, power to X and carbon recycling. So, solar and wind electricity fishes water in oxygen and hydrogen. H2 and carbon can be chemically linked to produce methanol. So carbon is eaten up, and this climate neutral methanol is then used instead of fuel or petrol and burned by cars, and it's a little bit tricky, more tricky when it comes to replacing coal. Methanol is not the ideal solution, but it is very pleasant for passenger cars. Think, for example, a car owner in Cameroon or elsewhere can use methanol, but not with ammonia. So industry should rely on hydrogen or H2-based synthetic fuels. What not many people know when they discuss about climate is that only a little bit more than half of the climate protection is energy policy. We almost pretend as if it were 99%. No, around 45% is material politics, especially recycling politics, and this is exactly what Franz Timmermans says, Ursula von der Leyen's deputy, who is at the same time the top manager of the European Green New Deal and the recirculation economy. But so far, recirculation economy is still in its infancy, so 8.6% is circular. And so 93.4% is not, it is the throwaway economy. And some of the worst, also when it comes to climate protection, is ore mining. Here you see a large truck, which is tiny, on this ore dump. Circular economy not only means recycling, it also means sustainability or product sustainability and efficient use, and maybe 5 times better. I worked with an Australian team to publish the book Factor 5. It's also available in Chinese, just like almost all my Club of Rome books. And the Chinese who read this told me, this is the philosophy of the 13th five-year plan. So we must urgently improve by a factor of 5. So quite a dramatic disconnection of wealth from nature consumption. This was the picture I showed earlier, that this correlation between carbon per capita and wealth per capita, so that this correlation is broken. So decoupling. This applies to materials and energy alike. One example, each of you knows this, aluminium from scrap rather than from bauxite. This is a factor 5 better in terms of material and energy. Or another example, the passive house. My family and I, we live in such a passive house. It's marvelous. We have no heating costs. Practically no heating costs. When it comes to heating costs, it's a factor of 10. And of course, you have ventilation with heat exchangers, so that the energy content of the living room temperature heats up the inflowing fresh air. I was head of the International Resource Panel of the United Nations. This all were honorary positions, just like the Club of Rome, and we had a working group on metals. And they sadly found that high-tech metals achieve recycling rates of typically of less than 1%. This doesn't apply to gold and platinum, but practically to all the other ones. And in order to recover this, we cannot take recourse to the old scrapping recycling tactics. This is not good enough, because with taking milligrams out of scrap, this doesn't work. So Nabil Nasser, who I invited to the international resource panels when I was in California, I met him and I thought he is the gentleman we need for a circular economy. He said, you need remanufacturing. Simply take the valuable metals and put them into robust components, and if the product, be it a smartphone, a tablet, a camera, a car or whatever, if it has reached the end of life, then you install the components in the new product. And Bosch took that seriously. 9,000 products I heard of Bosch are designed in such a way that remanufacturing works there. And they offer their customers either we repair it, which is an option, or we remanufacture, and the latter tends to be more elegant. And you can also develop other business models, leasing and user communities. Then maintenance, repair and longevity is positive. Whereas in the case of the throwaway economy, it's negative. But the question is, who wants the throwaway economy? And this is, of course, mass manufacturers. To them, it's great if all their products are disposed of. And there's a marvelous American book, Cheaponomics, which is also available in German. Cheaponomics was also the tip. Why cheap is too expensive? Because it is largely based on the fact that the damage that is done with no end, that also the climate damage and that the cost thereof is postponed to the next generation. This would be something for Fridays for Future to protest against. The throwaway society must end. This is an important part of structural change. Once again, back to the task of politics. We need some kind of price politics to the benefit of sustainability. Prices must tell the ecological truth to a certain extent. The market is not interested in this. The state must do so. Internationally, we should agree that primary raw material are made actively more expensive to the favor of the countries of origin, and we must tolerate this. And the WTO must reshape the World Trade Organization, because at present it strictly refuses all these measures. All this must be corrected. Competition law must be changed in such a way that it is not always the cheapest one who prevails. This is today's competition law. This was wrong thinking. In the old world, this was doable, but today, in my opinion, it's no longer permitted. When I was in the China Council and for the international cooperation and development, I was the head of a working group on economic instruments for energy efficiency and environmental protection, and I told the Chinese colleagues, well, do the following. Every year, increase energy and raw material, today we would say carbon prices, make them so many percent more expensive as the efficiency increased in the past year. So for carbon, we would say, decarbonization efficiencies, so that the monthly costs for energy and so forth would remain constant on average. Nevertheless, you still need social compensation, because this efficiency progress is perceived by rich families and by prospering companies sooner than in the case of poor people. This is necessary in order to avoid political rebellion in Germany too. We have political parties who say definitely no carbon tax. They simply do not want to have it. Remember the cartoon. And this idea is some kind of ping pong. So when energy efficiency increases, energy prices rise. When energy prices rise, energy efficiency is improved, or improving efficiency becomes more lucrative. This goes ping pong every year, or an upward spiral. And this, it was copied from the industrial revolutions. At that time, it was not about energy efficiency, but about labor productivity. So the industrial revolution meant that wages increased parallel to labor productivity. And this ping pong went for 150 years, and it worked. And at the end of the day, labor productivity had increased 20 times. And this was a fantastic success story. So you wonder, increase by 20 times? This worked for labor productivity with machinery and digitalization now. But when it comes to energy, it cannot work. This would distort the main theorem. This cannot work. Yes, it can work. In order to answer this question, please take a look at Mount Everest. And I always ask this my students. Imagine a 10-kilo bucket of water or a rucksack. And this is to be transported from sea level to the summit of Mount Everest. And then please calculate how many kilowatt hours it will need. And when I asked the students in California, they told me between 1,000 and 10,000, and I said wrong. And if I asked my students in Freiburg today, then they get more modest answers, 100 to 1,000. It's still wrong. The physical answer is 1/4 of a kilowatt hour.
It is unbelievable. I mean, you as experts in the power sector know that, but my students don't know. So therefore, a watt second is a Newton meter, so 1 meter high, and gravity conditions, and kilowatt hour is 900,000 watt seconds. So it can be calculated easily now, but for a standard newspaper reader, it's a great surprise. So that means that that term of energy requirement is an energy waste requirement. So this is something that we cannot make the economics responsible for, because that's how the world is done. The most cheapest is going to win. So therefore I do understand that in your agenda the payable energy is not included in the text. So if we don't correct the framework, that also those who are not the cheapest can win in the sense of this ping pong, and then to bring about a change in WTO rules and regulations. If we don't have that, then we cannot achieve it. Now, another task of politics is to regulate negative emissions, which is also usable for compensation. So that means the following. Here on this chart you can see the peak, and after that the brown area is the energy efficiency and renewable energy. So avoiding carbon. Now down here we see something else, carbon decreasing. That's also something we can do, and suitable for that are healthy soils that are still creating humus. So Martin Häusling, European Member of Parliament, has 2 employees, and together with them he wrote a great book about the myth of climate smart agricultural work. This is this image that you see right here is now good salts as CO2 eating things. Now, there agriculturists say, you take my CO2 and I take that CO2, that carbon, and turn it into a soil. Now, that's simplified. We could talk about this in greater depth for half an hour. But a very dangerous trend we currently witness in people who emit too much carbon, because these people argue, instead of saving carbon, I buy a piece of land in Africa and then I plant eucalyptus trees on it, and these trees consume CO2 and I calculate that as a carbon offset towards my own emissions. It sounds great from a financial perspective, but unfortunately such forests are prone to fireworks. This is an image from Portugal down here, but however, this fire is something that doesn't appear in my balance sheet, so therefore it's a fraud. So nature-based solutions, this term must be banned, because almost all of this is lies. Nevertheless, the European Commission is still engaging in that, and the industry and industrial pressure is still engaging in that. But from the perspective of an environmental scientist, I cannot agree to that. We need to do it differently. Carbon capture and storage, as a matter of principle, it's better. However, we need to make sure, same goes for radioactive scraps, that we need to guarantee that carbon stays in the soil. So with industrial scraps, it's not easy done. But it's still better than nature-based solutions with these forests. But even better than that is carbon capture and use. Now, for that, there are a number of different possibilities. With methanol, I've already talked about this. There are 100 of other technologies that we can use for carbon to use it as some kind of raw material. I will not go into greater detail because you know that much better than me. Now here, in the end, please allow me a few remarks on the New Enlightenment. With today's short-term rationalism, this is the status quo that's currently implemented in the industry. We cannot think that this is something that they do on purpose. Many of the ideas, however, cannot be implemented. The budget approach, for example, cannot be implemented. It's no wonder that not only in coal countries and in many other countries this is dismissed. So here, others who tell the ecological truth, if they say how high these prices should actually be, then of course, and in the end, we don't want these increased prices. Look at the caricature, these lies, etc. Now, these cheaper doctrine, they don't want it because they are looking forward to it. So this egoism that must be replaced by humbleness, and so therefore we need to talk about something that is at the core of this. Now, this civilization, the people, needs a new enlightenment in order for the many things that is required for the climate is also accepted by these people. So therefore we need to differentiate between an empty world and a filled world, a full world. Herman Daly said so, and for a period of time he was the chief economist of the World Bank, so he was no ecological dummy. But he said earlier we had the void world, and now we have a full world. The void world was sustainable, but the full world is not sustainable. These trends are not sustainable. Now, enlightenment in the 17th and 18th century, it was a fantastic thing for the empty world, for the void world. So here are different representatives of the Enlightenment. I will not talk about them, but Enlightenment brought about the Industrial Revolution, facilitated it, and so therefore here in this curve we can see up to 1800 the per capita income remains low and constant, and only with this kick-off of the steam turbine machine, steam machine of Watt, etc., all of that came into action. And so after the year 1950 we can see major trend upwards. So enlightenment also meant that hygiene was improved, medicine was improved, new, better nourishment of the people. All of that is good, but as a consequence, we had a great, vast over population. So many people came into the world. So therefore, the body weight of those who live in the rural areas and of the 67% of that body weight are our animals that we feed in order to eat them. So swines and chicken, etc. So 30% is the weight of us people. And 3% is what remains for all the other wild animals. So all of the big elephants are included in that. So with the ancient Greeks, it was the other way around. The weight of the humans was 3%, and the weight of wild animals was 95%, and maybe 2% was left for domesticated animals. So it is a macabre story, but it is a true story. That's the science of it. Natural science. So how about this 2.0 of enlightenment for a filled world? There's one component, and this is maybe as complex as Immanuel Kant, but this is only one aspect. Also in the US, they are calling for enlightenment now. Professor Steven Pinker, a renowned, famous person in America, but what he wants to do is to re-establish the old enlightenment after the fact that they've had a president who was lying all the time. This is legitimate, but this is not something that we have in mind when we talk about enlightenment, because we are about something that lies deeper. It is about relevating this to a utilitarian approach that is currently approached. As a natural scientist, I'm in favor of rational analysis of something that is given by nature, no question about it. But that you transfer this to microeconomy, to the economy as such, that may be a huge mistake. One point of access for us at Club of Rome for the philosophical part was the Laudato Si by the Pope, the encyclica. So at its core, the economy that is destroying our common house, our world. And then we see a few of these great philosophers for enlightenment, and when we went over what they said, we learned they were fantastic in the void world. Adam Smith, free trade, Charles Darwin, David Ricardo, competitiveness. What they said was 100% right, but from today's perspective, and economists, it's quoted wrongly. So I will give you one example, David Ricardo, and there's an entire chapter dedicated to him. For Adam Smith, the geographical reach of the market was identical to the reach of law, state, or moral. And that meant that the market was tamed. But today the market is global and the law is national, if not very regional. So therefore, today's market is brutal. It is almost not subjected to laws. It is destructive. And this is today's economy. Neoliberal economists think in just the same way, and they talk about Adam Smith, and he would turn around in the grave would he hear about it. Now, enlightenment, instead of monocausal opinions that say that they are right, must do something else. In the Western countries, you can have an entire career based on the claim to be right. In Asia, however, to be in the balance is a sign of both knowledge and wisdom, and we can learn something from the Asian people, and by the way also from the African people, with the Untuku concept, where my self is the recognition of myself, the perception of myself through neighbors and their perspective, through other people. Now, a few caricatures show the balance between human and nature. What I've said about the animals and their weight is just the opposite. So here, short-term and long-term also needs to be in balance. So, totally self-understood. Also here, on this very day, from today, we need to think about the long perspective, Fridays for Future. So a balance between the state and the market. On the example of Adam Smith, for example, of course we need both the state and the market, and then we need a balance between public and private goods. In the Anglo-Saxon area, the private goods are most important, so therefore the public goods were put to waste, such as water and waste managers. So 6 years of my life I spent in the US, so I do know something. So here there's also a balance between the equal distribution that is just and the approach to perform something. Both of them are of course right. We need both of these things. We don't need to have a dogmatic approach here. We need a balance between innovation and traditional aspects. So in America, if you do something that is so disruptive technologies is what they call for. So disruptive technologies is disruptive and destructive technologies. So therefore the traditional approved thing is something that is also very important for machine engineering, agricultural work, and for repair, etc. So what is something that is proven to work, that can of course be very important for the economy of an entire country. So here balance between state and religion. So please, I'm not asking for a Christian Lutheran state and also for no Islamistic state, but a state with a prohibition to have a religion is also, of course, also beside the point. So there are a number of different demands for balance. So looking at this, balance and tolerance are only core parts of a new enlightenment. And with that, I would like to close and thank you for your highly esteemed attention.